In reality, a knight's weapons were not designed for the slow-motion, blockbuster-style duels we see in films. When they marched into battle, they had to use tools that were effective, reliable, and adaptable. Their primary weapon, the lance, was much more than just a long stick with a point. It was a shock weapon. Knights used lances to deliver a devastating first strike during a cavalry charge. Mounted at height with the full momentum of horse and rider, a lance could unseat a rider, break shields, or embed itself deep into armor. But after the initial charge, they often discarded or retracted the lance, because in close combat it was too cumbersome. Once dismounted or entangled with enemy infantry, the knight would switch to a shorter weapon, something more maneuverable. That's when the sword came into play. Historically, swords were not the flashy, enchanted blades of legend. They were tools of brutal efficiency. The typical knight sword had a double-edged blade designed for both cutting and thrusting. They trained to move fluidly between slashes and thrusts, depending on the situation. In a massed melee, thrusts were often more effective. Armor tended to be weaker at the joints, and a well-placed stab could penetrate a gauntlet or visor. But they also practiced cutting strokes heavily because they needed to account for unarmored or lightly armored opponents. Swords could be used to hook in, deflect strikes, or pry open shield edges. Knights were trained to use their swords in combination with shield, footwork, and timing, not just charging headlong into someone and hoping for a clean kill. Shields themselves were not purely defensive objects, but integral parts of a knight's offensive strategy. A shield bash could disrupt an enemy's balance, expose a weak spot, or knock away a weapon. Many knights carried heater shields or kite shields early in their careers, then moved to smaller, more agile designs as their style and tactics matured. In battle, a knight would often use his shield actively, stepping in with the shield to absorb impact, then following it with a quick counterattack. More advanced tactics involved using shields to control distance, force enemy weapons off target, or create openings. A shield wasn't just about protection, it was about controlling the fight. But not every fight was between sword and shield. On the battlefield, knights often carried secondary weapons: maces, warhammers, axes, and polearms. These choices depended on the style of warfare, the armor of the enemy, and terrain. A mace or hammer was ideal against heavily armored opponents because its blunt force could crush mail and plate armor where a blade might bounce. When confronting an infantry line with dense armor, a knight could use a warhammer to deliver concussive blows without relying on sharp edges. Similarly, axes were effective. Some had bearded heads that could hook onto shields or armor and pull an opponent off balance. Polearms like halberds or glaives gave knights reach, and when infantry carried them too, mounted knights could use them to threaten engaged spearmen or defend against massed foot soldiers. Specialized techniques existed for each type of weapon. For instance, when using a warhammer, knights learned to strike not just where the face of the hammer would land, but where the counterweight or spike could leverage into plate gaps. They practiced feeding the blow into vulnerable areas like the back of the skull guard or under the arms. And when wielding a polearm, some knights would fight dismounted, planting their polearm like a spear or pivoting it to deliver sweeping or thrusting attacks. The polearm was versatile. It could function like a spear for piercing, a halberd for slashing, or even a hook to pull cavalry or infantry off balance. Another essential piece of a knight's arsenal was the dagger, often called a rondel or bollock dagger. This small weapon was usually kept in reserve for the most brutal moments of a fight. When a knight's opponent was unhorsed or during grappling, the dagger became a lifesaver. In close quarters, once shields were down and swords were entangled or broken, a knight would use his dagger to exploit gaps in armor. The neck, joints, under the arms, or groin. Duels would often finish with a thrust to a weak point or a dagger to the throat. Such moments were far more common than dramatic two-handed sword clashes. Beyond individual weapons, the way knights used them was deeply influenced by the structure of medieval armies. On the battlefield, knights rarely fought one-on-one. Instead, they attacked in formations, or as part of a force with supporting infantry archers, crossbowmen, and other knights. During a cavalry charge, knights had to maintain cohesion, follow commands, and deliver their lances at the optimal moment. Formations mattered. If a charge broke, isolated knights became easy prey. This meant that discipline, training, and command structure were just as important as strength or sword skill. Many medieval battles were won or lost because one side routed or failed to regroup after the first impact. Furthermore, the gear they carried was heavy. A fully armored knight could weigh 50 to 70 kilograms, 110 to 150 pounds, in steel, not including weapons, horse gear, and supplies. That meant that endurance played a major role in how they fought. Knights trained to sustain movement in armor, to recover quickly after a charge, and to keep fighting even when exhausted. Their horses were also trained to bear weight, charge, stop quickly, and bear the impact of other horses or infantry. This synergy between rider and mount was crucial. Weapons were only as useful if the horse and rider could deliver and survive the moment of impact. We also need to talk about strategy. Real knights weren't just brute force warriors. Many were deeply tactical. They understood the value of terrain, reconnaissance, and timing. Before committing to a major attack, knights and their commanders would scout the battlefield, position themselves based on elevation or choke points, and coordinate with foot soldiers. A well-led cavalry unit would avoid unfavorable ground, muddy fields, bogs, hills, where their charge would be less effective. They would wait for a favorable moment, when the enemy formation is disrupted, when flanking infantry have done their job, or when archers have weakened the opponent. The charge would be timed, coordinated, and brutal, but not mindless. And when a knight was dismounted, either by design or by force, his tactics shifted. A dismounted knight could use his full arsenal: shield, sword, polearm, or dagger. In these moments, the knight was effectively a heavily armored infantryman, capable of delivering shock, but also of holding ground. In a melee, discipline mattered. Forming into tight shield walls, supporting each other, watching for enemy breakthroughs. Leadership was critical. Commanders had to keep morale high, organize reserves, and reinforce weak points. War was as much about logistics, control, and morale as it was about individual heroism. What about armor? The way knights used weapons was intimately connected to their armor. Plate armor evolved over centuries, and so did weapon tactics. In early medieval times, male-dominated, and weapons like swords and axes functioned differently. But by the high and late medieval period, when full plate armor became common, knights began to specialize in weapons that could exploit the weak points in a suit of plates: joints, helmets, visor slits, gauntlets. The heavy plate armor allowed the wearer to absorb certain impacts, but also created zones of relative vulnerability. A mace or hammer could deliver force through mail beneath the plate. A thin-pointed sword or dagger could pierce a gap. A hooked polearm could manipulate an opponent off balance. Knights had to be smart, not just strong. Even beyond the battlefield, knights trained extensively for these real combat conditions. Chivalric tournaments and jousts weren't just spectacle, they were practice grounds. In tournaments, knights simulated the wounds, fatigue, and pressure of real fights. They experimented with lances, shaped their shields, and learned to ride hard under stress. While tournament rules softened some realities, mock lances, blunted points, they still required real skill, real physical exertion, and real endurance. Many tournament champions were legendary not just for winning, but for surviving often dangerous trials. Their tournament experience translated into battlefield advantage because they understood how to time their charge, how to hit hard, and when to disengage. Finally, knights also understood the psychological aspect of weapon use. The battle wasn't just physical, it was mental. The sight of a massive armored cavalry charge bearing down could terrify foot soldiers. The thunderous noise of hooves, the flash of steel, the shouts of riders, all contributed to breaking enemy lines. Knights used that psychological edge to maximize the effect of their weapons. Their armor, their lances, their banners, every piece was part of a show of force. A well-placed charge didn't just injure, it demoralized. In essence, knights didn't just swing swords and charge with lances because movies make it look cool. They used their weapons with strategy, specialization, adaptation, and discipline. Every piece, from the hefty rose gold mace to the razor-sharp longsword, to the deceptively powerful warhammer, was part of a larger system. A knight's true strength lay not just in his weapon, but in his understanding of how to use it, when to strike, when to defend, when to charge, and when to retreat. When we look deeper into how knights actually fought, we also need to understand the environment in which their weapons were used. Battles were rarely fought on clean, open fields like in films. More often, they were fought in muddy terrain, uneven ground, forests, hills, or even tight castle courtyards where movement was restricted. This meant that the knight's choice of weapon changed constantly based on the surroundings. For example, in dense terrain such as woodlands or narrow village streets, long polearms were a disadvantage. The knight would instead rely on his sword, axe, or mace, weapons that worked well in tight spaces where sweeping strikes were impossible. In open fields, however, polearms and lances dominated because reach became the deciding factor. Knights trained for all these environments because real combat rarely allowed them to fight on their own terms. In siege warfare, knights relied on a different set of tactics and tools. When storming a castle, they might carry shields specifically designed to deflect arrows, known as pavises or mantlets. They also carried shorter, more compact weapons ideal for fighting on ladders or through narrow gatehouses. Swords and axes became favored tools for close quarters fighting on battlements. A knight climbing a ladder could not swing a longsword effectively, so he often thrust downward or upward through arrow slits. Inside castle walls, where space was constrained and enemies fought at arm's reach, even shields could become cumbersome. Knights frequently dropped their shields the moment they breached a gate, switching to two-handed grips on axes or swords, sacrificing defense for finishing power. These small details reveal the versatility demanded of knights. Not just physical strength, but adaptability under extreme pressure. This was extremely common in armored combat. Holding the blade allowed the knight to use his sword like a short spear or lever, thrusting the tip into gaps in armor or using the crossguard to hook an enemy's helmet. The edges of European swords were not razor-sharp along their entire length. The middle was often left duller, so half-swording wouldn't injure the user. Knights also used the murder stroke, flipping the sword around and striking with the pommel or crossguard like a hammer to concuss or disorient heavily armored opponents. These techniques are barely shown in movies, but they were standard in historical manuals. Speaking of manuals, the medieval world had an entire discipline known as martial science, equivalent to a structured curriculum of combat. Masters such as Johannes Lichtenauer, Fiore de Liberi, and Hans Talhofer wrote detailed treatises describing techniques that knights practiced extensively. These manuals covered everything: swordplay, grappling, polearms, mounted combat, armored wrestling, dagger fighting, and disarming techniques. Knights didn't just rely on brute force, they studied angles, leverage, timing, and footwork. They drilled counters, feints, guards, and binds. They understood that combat was not about swinging harder, but about creating openings, controlling distance, and reading an opponent's intention. The level of sophistication in these manuals proves that knights valued technical precision as much as raw power. Real combat was also deeply exhausting. Knights trained to maintain stamina in their armor, but even they struggled with heat, weight, and prolonged fighting. Movies often show long, extended duels, but real fights were brutally short. An engagement might last seconds or minutes before one fighter broke, fell, or was overwhelmed. Even small skirmishes drained enormous energy. In prolonged battles, knights rotated positions, falling back to rest while fresh fighters took their place. Commanders understood the importance of conserving strength, not just courage. This is why discipline mattered. A knight who overextended himself, chased too far, or broke formation put not only himself, but his entire unit at risk. Then there's the role of horsemanship, something often simplified in films. A knight's horse was as valuable as his armor. War horses were trained not just to run fast, but to fight. They learned to kick, bite, trample, and push. They were desensitized to loud noises, blood, arrows, and chaos. Knights practiced precise maneuvers at high speeds, wheeling, pivoting, charging, feinting, and stopping abruptly. They rode with their knees and hips, keeping their hands free to use their weapons. A well-trained knight could strike with a sword while maintaining balance, shield, reins, and stance on an unpredictable battlefield. This connection between rider and mount was almost like an unspoken language, and it made cavalry incredibly dangerous. A single mounted knight held as much force as several infantrymen, and their impact relied heavily on coordination and horsemanship. So the next time you watch a movie or read a fantasy novel, remember this. Real knights weren't just brute fighters. They were tactical warriors, highly trained, physically and mentally prepared, and deeply strategic. Their weapons were not props. They were extensions of themselves, tools of survival, and instruments of mastery. Their battles were not cinematic duels. They were brutal, chaotic, and weighted with real risk. And because of that, they perfected their use of every weapon in their arsenal. That is how knights actually used their weapons in battle. Not like the movies, but with purpose, skill, and relentless discipline.